The American dream was never supposed to fail. For generations, it was sold as a promise. Work hard, follow the rules, and life would reward you. A house with a white fence, a stable job, a better future for your children. It was more than an idea, it was an identity. And then one morning, everything cracked. It didn't happen with explosions or sirens. There was no single announcement, no official confession. The dream didn't collapse loudly. It fractured quietly, inside living rooms. Factories and neighborhoods across America. On that day, millions of Americans woke up believing they were safe, only to realize that the rules they trusted no longer protected them. The signs had been there for years. Wages had stopped growing, even as productivity soared. Jobs that once promised stability had become temporary, replaceable, disposable. Families worked longer hours just to stay in the same place. Debt replaced security. Credit replaced savings. But most people still believed. They believed the system was fair. They believed hard work still mattered. They believed the dream was delayed, not broken, until it wasn't. When the first cracks appeared, they showed up as small, personal losses. A factory closure here, a foreclosure there, a retirement account that suddenly didn't exist anymore. Each loss felt isolated, explainable, temporary. But beneath the surface, something far larger was happening. The American dream had been quietly redesigned. It was no longer built for everyone. It was optimized for a few. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that reshaped the economy, the workforce, and the meaning of success itself. Policies that rewarded speculation over labor, systems that privatized profit and socialized risk, rules written in language most people never saw, let alone understood. For decades, Americans were told to trust the process, and they did. They trusted banks that promised safety. They trusted corporations that promised loyalty. They trusted leaders who promised stability. What they didn't know was that the foundation beneath the dream was being hollowed out. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, it was already too late. Homes were no longer homes, they were assets. Jobs were no longer careers, they were costs. People were no longer citizens, they were data points. And when the pressure finally reached its breaking point, the dream didn't just crack. It exposed something far more unsettling. The realization that the American dream had never truly disappeared. It had simply changed owners. And for the first time, millions of people began to ask a question that had once been unthinkable. What happens when the dream was never meant for everyone? That question would mark the beginning of a reckoning America was not prepared for. And this was only the start. For a long time, the system survived on belief. As long as people believed the American dream was still alive, they tolerated the cracks. They blamed themselves instead of the structure. They worked harder, took second jobs, borrowed more, waited longer. Failure, they were told, was personal. If you struggled, you hadn't tried hard enough. If you fell behind, you made bad choices. If you lost everything, that was on you. This belief kept the machine running. But quietly, the rules were changing. Jobs that once paid enough to support a family were replaced with contracts and part-time work. Benefits disappeared. Pensions vanished. Healthcare became a privilege tied to employment that could be taken away overnight. At the same time, something else was happening. The cost of living climbed relentlessly. Housing prices rose faster than wages. Education turned into lifelong debt. Medical bills became a leading cause of bankruptcy. Saving money stopped being realistic for millions of families. Still, people believed. They believed the pain was temporary. They believed the economy would bounce back. They believed that if they just held on a little longer, things would improve. Then came the moment when belief collided with reality. Banks that had taken enormous risks collapsed, yet were rescued. Corporations that gambled with the economy were protected. Executives walked away with bonuses while workers lost jobs, homes, and futures. For the first time, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. When ordinary people failed, they were punished. When powerful institutions failed, they were saved. The message was subtle, but clear. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. Behind the scenes, wealth concentrated upward. Assets flowed toward those who already had them. Policies favored capital over labor. Speed over stability. Profit over people. The American dream didn't vanish overnight. It was slowly transferred, from workers to shareholders, from communities to corporations, from the many to the few. Entire towns felt it first. Factories closed, not because they were unproductive, but because profits could be higher elsewhere. Main streets emptied. Local businesses disappeared. Generations of identity vanished along with steady work. People who had done everything right, worked hard, stayed loyal, followed the rules, found themselves starting over in their 40s and 50s, with nothing but debt and uncertainty. And still, leaders told them to remain optimistic. They spoke of recovery, of growth, of opportunity. But opportunity increasingly required what most people no longer had: connections, capital, and the ability to absorb risk. For the first time, parents began to fear something their grandparents never did: that their children might live worse lives than they had. That fear spread quietly, from household to household, and as it spread, the American dream began to lose its most powerful fuel: hope. Without hope, people stopped believing the system was fair. Without belief, the cracks widened. What had once been a promise now felt like a performance, repeated loudly, even as fewer people experienced it. And deep down, many Americans began to sense an uncomfortable truth. The dream hadn't cracked because people stopped working hard. It cracked because the rules had changed, and no one had voted on it. The day the American dream cracked was not a single moment. It was the day people realized the game had been rigged long before they ever stepped onto the field. As belief faded, something else began to rise: anger. It didn't explode all at once. It simmered. It showed up in conversations at dinner tables, in break rooms, in online comments written late at night by people who felt invisible. People weren't just struggling anymore, they were confused. They had done what they were told. They went to school. They worked hard. They played by the rules. And yet, the finish line kept moving. The promise that effort would be rewarded no longer matched reality. Productivity continued to rise, but wages stayed flat. Profits soared, but security vanished. People worked more hours than ever, yet felt poorer, more anxious, and more disposable. The contradiction became impossible to explain away. For decades, Americans were taught that the market rewarded merit, that success was earned, that failure was deserved. But now, the evidence suggested something else entirely. Success depended less on effort and more on timing, inheritance, and access. The American dream, once framed as a ladder anyone could climb, now looked more like a wall: smooth at the top, steep at the bottom, nearly impossible to scale without help from above. Trust began to erode. Trust in corporations that preached loyalty while laying off thousands. Trust in institutions that promised stability while protecting those who caused instability. Trust in leaders who spoke of opportunity while living untouched by its absence. People noticed that when crises hit, the burden always fell downward. Workers lost jobs. Families lost homes. Communities lost futures. But the architects of those crises rarely faced consequences. This imbalance reshaped how Americans saw themselves. Work stopped feeling like dignity. Debt stopped feeling temporary. The future stopped feeling guaranteed. Instead of planning for tomorrow, people focused on surviving today. The dream had always been about upward movement, about progress. Now for many, the best hope was simply not falling backward. That shift carried a quiet psychological cost. Anxiety replaced optimism. Exhaustion replaced ambition. Cynicism replaced trust. People began to question not just the economy, but the story they had been told about it. Why did hard work no longer protect you? Why did one mistake erase decades of effort? Why did the system forgive power but punish vulnerability? These questions didn't have easy answers. And without answers, frustration turned inward, then outward. The American dream had once united people around a shared belief. Now its failure exposed divisions, between those who still benefited from the system and those who felt abandoned by it. And as that divide widened, something dangerous happened. People stopped believing the future was predictable. They stopped believing the rules applied equally. They stopped believing anyone was really in control. The crack in the dream was no longer economic. It was emotional. It was cultural. It was existential. And once that kind of fracture appears, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads into politics, into trust, into the very idea of what a nation owes its people. The American dream had not just cracked under pressure. It had revealed a deeper truth. A dream that only works for some eventually stops working for everyone. And America was about to feel the consequences of that realization. As the cracks widened, the consequences became impossible to contain. What had started as economic frustration slowly transformed into something deeper and more volatile. People were no longer just questioning their finances. They were questioning the meaning of fairness, responsibility, and belonging. The American dream had promised stability through effort. Now, effort felt disconnected from outcome. This disconnect changed behavior. People delayed marriage. They delayed having children. They delayed buying homes, not by choice, but by necessity. Entire life plans were put on hold. A generation grew up watching their parents lose everything they had worked for, and they learned a dangerous lesson early. Loyalty did not guarantee protection. Workplaces became transactional. Employees stopped believing in long-term commitment. Companies expected flexibility, but offered none in return. Job security was replaced by adaptability, and adaptability came with constant anxiety. The safety nets people assumed existed were thinner than they imagined. Healthcare depended on employment. Retirement depended on markets. Education depended on debt. One unexpected event, a medical emergency, a layoff, a recession, was enough to push families over the edge. And it happened again and again. Each crisis reinforced the same truth. The system could absorb shocks, but people could not. As trust eroded, institutions struggled to maintain legitimacy. Messages about recovery and growth sounded hollow to those still drowning. Optimism began to feel like propaganda rather than promise. People stopped asking when things would get better. They started asking who the system was really designed to serve. The answer became increasingly clear. Those with assets were protected. Those without were exposed. The dream that once defined American identity now divided it. Some still lived inside it, insulated by wealth, access, and opportunity. Others existed just outside its reach, close enough to see it, but too far to touch it. This gap reshaped the national conversation. Success stories were celebrated louder than ever, even as they became less common. Failure was hidden, stigmatized, or blamed on individuals. The distance between narrative and reality grew wider by the day, and when people feel unheard, unseen, and unsupported, frustration seeks an outlet. Faith in gradual improvement weakened. Patience ran out. The idea that tomorrow would naturally be better than today, once a core belief, began to disappear. In its place grew uncertainty. Uncertainty about work, uncertainty about institutions, uncertainty about the future itself. The American dream had always relied on one fragile assumption, that progress was inevitable. Once that assumption collapsed, so did the sense of direction. The country found itself at a crossroads it didn't know how to name. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic revolution, but a slow unraveling of confidence. And as the dream continued to fracture, one uncomfortable realization took hold across millions of lives. If the system could no longer guarantee stability, then stability would have to be found elsewhere, or not at all. The American dream had lost its power to unify, and without a shared dream, the nation was forced to confront a question it had long avoided. What replaces a promise when people stop believing it was ever meant for them? When the dream finally broke, it did not shatter into pieces. It faded. There was no single moment when America collectively admitted the promise was gone. No announcement, no apology. Just a quiet shift in expectations. People stopped planning far ahead. They stopped assuming progress was guaranteed. They learned to brace themselves. Survival replaced aspiration. For many, success no longer meant getting ahead. It meant not falling behind, paying rent on time, keeping health insurance, avoiding emergencies. Life became a series of careful calculations, measured in risks rather than possibilities. The dream that once inspired ambition now demanded caution. And yet something else began to emerge in the cracks. Clarity. People started to see the system more honestly, not as a moral judge, but as a set of incentives. They noticed who benefited when rules were written, who absorbed losses when things went wrong, and who was asked to remain patient when patience had already been exhausted. The illusion that effort alone determined outcomes finally lost its grip. This realization was painful, but it was also freeing. Without the myth, people began to ask better questions. Why should healthcare depend on employment? Why should education require decades of debt? Why should housing be treated primarily as an investment rather than a necessity? These questions had always existed at the margins. Now they moved to the center. The American dream, stripped of its shine, revealed what it had always been. A story powerful enough to unite, but fragile enough to conceal inequality. It had motivated generations, even as it masked who truly had access to its rewards. Its collapse forced a reckoning. Not everyone experienced it the same way. Some still thrived, some adapted, some never recovered. But almost everyone felt the shift, the quiet understanding that the future was no longer a promise, but a negotiation. The dream did not die because people stopped believing in hard work. It cracked because belief was no longer enough. In its place, Americans were left with a choice: to cling to a story that no longer matched reality, or to imagine something new, something more honest, more inclusive, more resilient. That choice remains unresolved. The American dream may have cracked, but what comes next has yet to be written. Whether the fracture becomes a permanent break or a chance to rebuild depends on what people are willing to confront and what they are willing to change. Because a dream that only works when no one looks too closely was never meant to last forever. And perhaps the most important lesson hidden within its collapse is this: a nation is not defined by the promises it repeats, but by the realities it is willing to face. The day the American dream cracked was not the end of the story. It was the moment the story demanded a new beginning.